I think while people are settling in, it's fine. We can just let's take a moment to also generate our motivation. And specifically, actually, we could briefly just remember the three scopes, right, of motivation that are taught in the Lam Rim, which is our text that we're studying. So first is the low scope, right, that aims for something more than this life, right, that aims for a good future rebirth. What's that line? If you're attached to the affairs of this life, right, then that's not Dharma practice. That's not yet Dharma practice. If you're doing something with that motivation. But aiming for a good future life is the minimum sort of level of Dharma practice motivation. And there's like the middle scope motivation. One gives up like a grasping or attachment to samsara itself and aims for liberation from the suffering of samsara. So we have to, for that one, remember it's taught in the Lam Rim in great detail, but we have to actually face our own suffering. Understand its causes, and then aspire to liberation from suffering and its causes. There's actually a kind of, I think of that as one of the deepest forms of self-compassion, actually. So in other words, having compassion for oneself, wanting to liberate oneself from suffering. And being willing to face what are the causes of that suffering in myself, honestly, and then striving for liberation from those. And then bodhicitta motivation. And so that's just, like, once you've developed renunciation, right, on that foundation, then you recognize everyone else is just like me. They also have suffering and the causes of suffering. Just like I do. And so we expand, and essentially you could say you expand the motivation from the middle scope that wishes for your own liberation, and now you wish for the liberation of all sentient beings, striving for Buddhahood itself to liberate all sentient beings from suffering. Grounded in love and compassion for all sentient beings. And the attitude of universal responsibility, or the unusual attitude of altruistic responsibility, that takes on the responsibility of liberating all sentient beings, and therefore strives for Buddhahood for that purpose. So with that motivation in mind, then we can recite the verse. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And for those who have the text, we're on page 244. We'll just continue on from there. So we left off with, I'll just reread that one part. We left off on where near the bottom of that page, Lama Tsongkhapa had quoted Chandrakirti's commentary on the Middle Way, in which he said, delusion is the ignorance that superimposes a non-existent own entity of things. It has the nature of obstructing the view of their inherent existence. It conceals them. So we've been covering that, right? How the mind of so delusion, right? He's saying it superimposes what does it superimpose onto things? An own entity, right? So we've used different terms: inherent existence or existence by nature. Here there are different terms to get this idea, right? But here he's saying own entity, right? As if things have their own entity from their own side and aren't don't exist. It's implying, right, that things have their own entity from their own side and are not merely labeled.
So what does entity mean?
Entity?
Yeah.
So entity means like nature, or so for example, feeling like it would be like superimposing that this is a bell from its own side.
Well, it is a bell.
From its own side, that's what I said.
From its own side? What side?
So the question is it a bell? How does it exist as a bell? Of course it's a bell, right? Yes.
Well, a bell is a name.
Yeah.
Given to a base, a very base.
Yeah. Yeah, and so believing that it exists as a bell from its own side rather than as independent. Because what we're saying in a way is that the way the bell exists is dependent origination.
What does dependent origination mean?
So it means it's dependent upon various factors, right? The base, the label, the mind labeling. There are many different factors there.
But the label is a name you give to a particular base.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be something you label. Those are just words you give to a base.
Mm-hmm.
Without a base, you can create a word. The word is just created out of a base. First you have to see a base and you create the label. So you're talking words.
Actually,
what do they mean?
No, the word is not, actually the words are not labeled, they don't come from the base. They come from your mind.
They come from the mind.
Yeah, words always come from your mind, right? They don't come from the base.
But the words come from the mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And so he's saying, right, so he's saying here, ignorance is delusion is the ignorance that superimposes a non-existent, right, and that's important, non-existent, own entity onto things. It has the nature of obstructing the view of their inherent existence. It conceals them. And so what he's saying there is when we superimpose in that way, and then it conceals the actual nature of those things, right? Which is, and the actual nature of those things is their emptiness. So now he says,
it's a little confusing in that it's like it's happening twice, doubly concealed. Has the nature of obstructing the view of their inherent existence is false to begin with, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then obstructing that view of the inherent existence.
yeah, it's an odd phrasing, isn't it? The view of their inherent existence conceals them. Because the meaning, according to the commentary of that, is that it's actually interesting. What it really is obstructing is their emptiness. So their ultimate nature. So the word inherent existence there, it's funny, yeah, I'm not sure why they translate it that way. You're right. It conceals, because what it's concealing is the emptiness of those things. So that word, obstructing the view of their inherent existence, I'm not sure why they phrase it that way. I'm not sure if that's a funny phrasing. It would imply that their inherent existence is emptiness, but of course emptiness is not usually described as an inherent existence. So yeah, I'm not sure why they phrase it that way.
That's
Like that?
before you define inheritance, its existence as more than merely labeled by the mind.
Yeah, so it's not really obstructing that, it's obstructing their emptiness, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not sure why they actually, that phrasing seems funny to me too. It has the nature of obscuring, of obstructing the view of their, yeah. Because it's really, it has the nature of creating an obstructing view of inherent existence. That would be a more correct
So
way
let me
to
ask
say
you a
that.
question, right? Let's say somebody who's blind, or somebody who doesn't speak, right? They don't have languages. So how do they describe things? How do they like communicate things? We forget about words. Let's forget about words. Somebody who doesn't know how to speak, doesn't know how to see. How do they describe? And then they see a base. When they look at the base, somebody who doesn't speak, what do they create words? How do they communicate?
Actually, well, one point is, I mean, the kind of, actually, this isn't getting at that, first of all, this verse is not talking about that directly, but, actually, in this sense, words, right, don't have to be spoken, they can be taught.
Yeah, but you explain in terms of words, explain in terms of practical, like, the meaning, what they really mean, let's say I show you this, right? I show you this like this. What do you see? This is a base. When you see a base, when you see this part, let's say you're from Amazon, they don't have the concept of this. So what would you say for when you're from Amazon and I show you something like this? How would you call it? What would you say?
Because one point that's important to understand with this is that,
I just want to say the communication without words. Don't communicate with words. Just say, how would you say this?
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking, to be honest.
So what I'm trying to say is there many ways to communicate, or is there only one way to communicate?
So you're asking, is there non-verbal communication?
Yes, is that
Of course
possible?
there's, yeah, of course.
Oh, there is. What is it then?
A gesture, right, for example.
No, but that's still the body.
That's the what?
The body.
Right.
Yeah, but can you communicate without the body?
Well, you have to agree.
Yeah.
For me to communicate with you, you and I have to agree on what we're talking about. The thing we're talking about is almost
Yeah.
immaterial.
Yes. So meaning
So
without something else making something else happen, it would be impossible for something to happen.
yeah, it takes
To
something
tango.
happening here, something happening there.
Just a tango.
Well, it's two or three things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So continuing on, he says, thus, through the power of afflicted ignorance included in the links of cyclic existence. And I'll read the commentaries to that. It says, the statement asserts that the apprehension of objects as truly existent is ignorance, and that this is an afflicted ignorance. Therefore, there is accordance here with the former of the two ways of positing the apprehension of a self of phenomena as a mental affliction and as an obscuration to knowledge. And so part of what's being gotten at here, just to understand there are a couple points that are being made. One is this ignorance that he was just describing, right? That he described in the previous verse. One point he's making in this quote, right, where he says, included in the links of cyclic existence, is that it's the first of the 12 links of dependent origination that creates cyclic existence, right? When you think of the presentation by the Buddha of the 12 links of dependent origination, so he's saying that ignorance is that first link. That's one point being made there. Then a second point that's being made there in the commentary here is he says, the apprehension of objects as truly existence is ignorance, and he says, and it is an afflicted ignorance. And so what he's saying there, and to be clear, I'll explain why he's saying this, because it may seem unclear, I would think, to some people. What he's getting at here is that some Buddhist tenet systems assert, for example, the Svatantrika Majjhimikas assert this, that ignorance grasping at the inherently existent I is the cause of suffering that must be overcome, but that ignorance grasping at the inherent existence of objects is not a mental affliction, it's an obscuration to knowledge. And that one removing that allows one to become omniscient. Prasangika Madhyamaka disagrees with that. And so what he's saying here is, this kind of ignorance grasping at the inherent existence of objects is not just an obscuration to knowledge, it's a mental affliction. And that's a specific tenet of the Prasangika school of philosophy that's different from some of the other philosophical schools, if that makes sense. So let me continue on finish this point. So, and so does that make sense? Because if you think of the path to Buddhahood, right, there are mental afflictions, which are a cause of suffering, and then there are obscurations to knowledge, which are not actual causes of suffering, right? Because arhats have gotten rid of their mental afflictions, but aren't omniscient. Does that make sense? And so, to become a Buddha, you have to. So to become a Buddha, one has to remove both the afflictive obscurations and the obscurations to knowledge. Here he's saying, from the Prasangika school's perspective, one has to, that the grasping at a self of phenomena is a mental affliction. Does that make sense? The grasping at a self of phenomena, because remember there are two types of self-grasping. There's the grasping of self of persons, and they're categorized, this is important, from the Prasangika school's perspective, other schools disagree with this actually, but the Prasangika school is considered to be the most subtle, right? So some schools say that the grasping at a self of persons and grasping of self phenomena are different levels of subtlety. Some say one is a mental affliction, one's not. The Prasangika school's position is those two types of self-grasping are equally subtle and are both mental afflictions. So that's what he's saying here. That they're forms of ignorance, they're mental afflictions, and they have to be overcome in order to be liberated from samsara. Does that make sense? That point?
You're saying that another heart have achieved omniscience. You're saying that, right?
No.
I thought you had that.
No, an arhat has achieved liberation from samsara, but not
So
necessarily.
let me ask you the question: what's mental affliction? What's the mental affliction? Is it a word or is it a true thing?
A mental affliction is an existent phenomena.
And what's the phenomena? Is it people or maras, spirit? What's the entity?
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking.
For me, like I think mental affliction as spirits. Because if you not become a Buddha, you have to overcome the four maras, the four spirits, different kind of spirits.
Oh, not all four maras are actual spirits. Only one of them is a being.
No, four of them are spirits. Because they all depend on rising. In order for us to function, we depend upon others. In order for me to function, somebody's making me function. Somebody is superior than myself. So I have to overcome those things that make me, govern me, makes me function. That's what dependent arising means. Once I overcome all those stuff, then I become a Buddha. And then as a Buddha, you're self-conditioned. That's it. Nothing conditioned you. You overcome those maras. You're just your own person, your own light. You're just your own shoes. You walk in your own shoes.
So we got to continue on with the
Okay.
text. Okay. Yeah. So the next section, he says, I'm going to first start with the headline, the outline. Showing that this manner of identifying the apprehension of true existence is asserted by the Noble Father and his Son. And so here, what he's saying, he's going, that point that he just made about the nature of ignorance, right? He's now going to show that is consistent with the teaching of Nagarjuna and Aryadeva. That's the father and son in this sense, right? In this context, that's the father and son. So then he's going to quote first 70 stanzas on emptiness, which is a teaching by Nagarjuna. And he says, that which conceives things born from causes and conditions to be real was said by the teacher to be ignorance. From that the 12 links arise. With good understanding that things are empty, through seeing reality, there is no ignorance. That is the cessation of ignorance, whereby the 12 links cease to exist. And so first of all, he's doing a couple things here, right? One is he's quoting Nagarjuna and he's just showing that this teaching he's giving is consistent with what Nagarjuna's view of the nature of reality is. Another thing he's doing, though, if you look at the actual quote, right, is he's saying Nagarjuna agrees, right, that, because how does he say it here? That which conceives things born from causes and conditions to be real, right? So he's pointing out, because some people could say, well, I'm just going to go back, right? Some people could say, hey, wait a second, the Svatantrika Majjhimikas say things that the grasping at a self of phenomena is not a mental affliction, right? And so then you can say, well, which is the actual view of Nagarjuna? Because they all say they're Majjhimikas, right? The Prasangikas are Majjhimikas, the Svatantrika Majjhimikas are Majjhimikas. And so here he's saying, he's taken the position of Chandrakirti, right? Saying that the grasping at a self of phenomena is a mental affliction. And so now he's saying, I'm going to show you that Nagarjuna agrees with this point, then that's why Chandrakirti is correct in his interpretation of Nagarjuna. As you can see here, he's saying, that's why it's important here that it says, conceives things born from cause and conditions to be real. And he's saying that is one of the 12 links of dependent origination, which therefore are cause of suffering, and therefore is a mental affliction. Does that make sense? And he's saying, so that's Nagarjuna's position, and then Nagarjuna is saying, and if you overcome that grasping at a self, then you'll overcome the 12, stop the process of the 12 links of dependent origination, which are the cause of samsara, and you'll achieve liberation. And so he's saying, you can see from that quote that Arya Nagarjuna is consistent with Chandrakirti on this point, viewing the grasping at a self of phenomena as as one of the 12 links, and therefore as a mental affliction that causes the suffering of samsara. And then he says here, to conceive things to be real is to apprehend them as established in reality or truly. This is similar to the meaning from the Precious Garland, which is also by Nagarjuna. Right? And here he says, as long as the aggregates are apprehended, and I will be apprehended in them. And so there again, he's showing that as long as there's grasping at a self of phenomena, meaning the aggregates, there's going to be self-grasping. Does that make sense? And then he quotes also the 400 stanzas, which is a teaching by the son, meaning Aryadeva, right, the student of Nagarjuna. It says, and this will come up again, so I'll just so it says here, like the body sense in the body, delusion abides in all of them. Therefore, by conquering delusion, all the mental afflictions are conquered. Delusion will no more arise if dependent arising is seen. Therefore, with all my effort here, I will only talk about that. And so here Aryadeva is making an interesting point. And what he's getting at here is he's using a metaphor. So the metaphor is this, is as long as he's saying the body sense in the body. So what he's saying is, if you have as long as you're alive, right, and you have your body set, so like your senses in your body, if the body sense is there, then all the other senses also function, if that makes sense. Like in other words, so as long as you're alive and you have this sense of embodiment, or body sense here, body sense power, then the other sense powers arise dependent upon that. So the eye sense, ear sense, nose sense, and so on. And so what he's getting at is that sort of the body, the body sense in that sense is primary and pervades all the others, and it goes to the eyes when you're seeing, it goes to the ears when you're hearing, it goes to the nose when you're smelling, and so on. And so he's using that as a metaphor. And what he's saying is, ignorance is primary, and is, how does he say here? Abides in all, when he says delusion abides in all of them, what he's saying is ignorance abides in all the mental afflictions. Does that make sense? So, and we're going to get into more detail about this later. So it's an important point he's making. But we know that, right? The Buddhist teaching is that sometimes we say in dependence upon ignorance, all the other mental afflictions arise. Or we could say that ignorance pervades all the other mental afflictions, or ignorance abides in all the other, that all the other mental afflictions are kind of dependent upon ignorance, that ignorance abides in them, and so on. And then he's saying, of course, so if you eliminate ignorance or delusion, all the other mental afflictions will also cease. And the metaphor there would be like if a person dies, their body sense stops, and of course all their other senses also stop at that time. So he says, as regards to the delusion set forth in this manner, the context is an identification of a delusion, which is one of the three poisons, right? And again, so he's making this point, That in this context, ignorance is a mental affliction. Right?
Is he then saying that the body sense is illusory?
Where would he say? Which line?
I mean, right back up at in the first 400 stanzas, it also says, like the body sense in the body, delusion abides in all of them.
No. So what he's saying there is like it's actually a metaphor.
Tactile sense you're calling, or?
Yeah. So I think what he's getting at here is this: is that yeah, like it's actually he's not saying that the body sense is illusory. What he's saying, he's using it as a metaphor, really. So what he's saying is, as long as you have if a person has the tactile, like the sense, the tactile sense, then their other sense powers can function. And he's saying, like that, if you have ignorance, all the other mental afflictions can function. So it's like more like a parallel. Does that make sense? It's not a commentary on the body sense. It's more like he's drawing a parallel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's like he's drawing a parallel there. He's saying, just like if you have this, the body sense, then all your other senses could function. Similar, and it sort of, it goes to, they sometimes talk about it this way, like it goes, like when you're hearing, your sense powers sort of focus on the ear consciousness and so on. He's saying it's similar to that. He's saying that, like that, it's sort of a metaphor, or now I'm saying it as a simile actually, but like that, when you have ignorance, it sort of empowers all the other mental afflictions. In the same way that the body sense empowers the other senses. Similarly, ignorance empowers all the mental afflictions and abides within them, and sort of is their empowering condition or something. Yeah, is there? I'm not sure if that's the right way to say it. Empowers them and allows them to function. That's the right way to say it.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Yeah. So he's not, that line, delusion abides in all of them, is not saying it abides in all the senses. Here, I mean, that's not what this verse is saying. This verse is saying, just like the body sense empowers the other sense consciousnesses, ignorance empowers all the mental afflictions. That's what he's getting at there. And he's saying, therefore, and that's why he's saying, therefore, by conquering ignorance or delusion, all the mental afflictions will be conquered. And so that's what he's getting at there. Is that like and the metaphor there is like, if somebody is killed, for example, all their senses stop functioning. So he's drawing a parallel. That's all. Like for how to stop the process of suffering. He says, it is therefore called afflicted. It is therefore afflicted ignorance. That's what we've been saying. So it is a mental affliction. Right? In order to stop this ignorance, it is said to be necessary to realize the profound meaning of interdependence. Right? And remember, in this system, right, of Chandrakirti, that comes from the Garjana and the Prasangika system, the profound meaning of interdependence, as it says in this sentence, the meaning of emptiness appearing as the meaning of dependent arising. Right? So he's saying that those two meanings, are one. Right? Actually, right? The meaning of dependent origination is the meaning of emptiness. The meaning of emptiness is the meaning of dependent origination, and that only by realizing that can you overcome this afflicted ignorance. In accordance with an explanation on in the commentaries of this text, afflicted delusion should therefore be taken to be a superimposition of true existence onto things. This manner of understanding was set forth clearly by the Venerable Chandrakirti, following the example of Buddha Palada's commentary on Arya Nagarjuna's intention. And so he's being very clear there, right? He's saying, this is the very specific position of the Prasangika school. That school comes through Nagarjuna, Buddha Palada, Chandrakirti, and I'm presenting it in accordance with that very specific presentation, which is different than the presentation of the Svatantrika Machampikas, for example. Right? And so he's just, that's why he's mentioning who this comes from, is he's trying to clarify for us. And this is important because if you're later going to read the text, right, then you'll know, okay, if I'm reading something by Chandrakirti, for example, it's going to be in accordance with this explanation. If you read something by, say, Shantarakshita, there will be differences from this presentation because he's an example of a Svatantrika Machamika. And so he's trying to give you, it's like he's giving you a key to understanding the text section of those great masters. Now, in the next section, demonstration that afflicted ignorance is the root of revolving and cyclic existence, which has already been started to be addressed, right? Because he was saying it's the first of the 12 links, right? And part of this, just to give a context for a second, is he's emphasizing that, here we're in the section on special insight into emptiness, right? And so he's now pausing and he's saying, not understanding emptiness, right, is the cause of all suffering and samsara, right? And so he's both trying to help us to do a few things in this whole section, right? One is correctly identify the object of negation, right? Because if you don't do that, as he says, as we've covered, right? If you don't do that correctly, your meditation on emptiness will not be correct, because you don't know what things are empty of. But then another point here is why understand emptiness? Like, why is it important? Right? And what he's pointing out is it's quite important, and the reason why it's it's the most important thing in some sense, is because if it's the root of cyclic existence, right? In other words, so if you can't overcome that ignorance, you'll continue to suffer, and if you're continuing to suffer, you can't liberate others from suffering, right? So whether you want to liberate yourself and also others, if you don't understand this point, he's saying, then, I mean, this is the context, right? Then how you can't liberate yourself or others from suffering if you don't understand what the cause of suffering is and how to eliminate it, which is this teaching. Does that make sense? So he's giving us some context here, in terms of both what's the object of negation, but also our motivation for really understanding this point correctly. And again, because it's not the easiest point to understand, right? But that's why he's going into great detail on that it's crucial to understand it, because otherwise you won't uproot the root of samsara.
How does that attack the innate arising of thinking that truly exists? Because we just talked about the innate, seeing the innate rising. So it seems like one is educational, the other is the feeling. Or is that correct?
Actually, I mean, you're asking a good question, because that's exactly what's covered in this next section.
Sorry.
So, I mean, maybe let's actually. So let's go into the section and then tell me if it doesn't. If it's not, doesn't seem fully answered.
Cool.
But that's exactly what you're asking the right question, because that's exactly what he's about to get into. But if it doesn't seem like he answers that fully, or if I don't explain it way that seems clear, then ask it again.
All right. And I actually read it, so
But it's,
clearly I didn't understand it.
yeah, so it's there. You know. Yeah, because he's getting into now exactly that question of. So he says here, that being so, the ignorance apprehending the two selves, right? So the two selves here are self of phenomena and self of persons, right? Which are, in a sense, they have the same mode of grasping. They're the same level of subtlety. They're both mental afflictions, but they're just categorized according to, are you talking about yourself or are you talking about a phenomena, right? So, that being so, the ignorance apprehending the two selves explained above is not the apprehension of artificial selves of persons and phenomena that are imputed by the uncommon assertions of non-Buddhist and Buddhist tenet systems. So what he's saying here is starting to address what Paul's asking. He's saying, remember we're talking about the object of negation, right? That's what kind of we're talking about here. And he's saying here, if you're going to liberate yourself from the cause of suffering, right? The true cause of suffering, it has to be that innate self-grasping. And now he's going to get into all the things that are sometimes negated in texts on emptiness, but are not the ultimate point of what's to be negated.
Lauren,
Yeah.
like Lama Zopa says that the object of negation is very subtle. It exists, but it's very subtle. Oh, we see gross ones, but it's a subtle one that we give name. So that's what we need to negate, right?
Exactly, and that's what he's covering here.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got it. That's
Yeah.
it. And so here he's saying, I'm going to go through a few examples because that's what he does here. First one is he's saying some texts and some Buddhist teachings will negate a permanent, unitary, independent person. And that is to be negated, but that's not the subtle object of negation. Make sense? So sometimes you'll see a text, right, where a person will be negating, say, a permanent self. And there is no permanent self, so that's a correct thing to negate, but that's not what he's saying, that's not the innate self-grasping. A unitary, and actually there are whole texts that have these three together, permanent, unitary, and independent. And what he's saying is, while texts do negate such a thing, while such a thing doesn't exist, that's not the subtle innate grasping. That's something theoretical, right? This sort of idea of a permanent, unitary, independent self, that's actually an assertion of non-Buddhist schools, right? And so somebody who studied Hinduism might, for example, or many Western religious traditions assert this kind of thing, right? A soul, for example, that exists as a permanent, unitary, independent phenomena, Anyway, what he's saying is, while that can be negated, that's not the subtle object of negation. That's an object of negation that's, what's the word he uses here? He says, like, sometimes they say artificial, or acquired, or intellectually acquired. It's not the subtle one. Does that make sense? Then he says, so that's not the correct. So it's like that can be negated, but it's not the correct one to eliminate suffering. Then he says, second one that he's giving an example, he says, external objects of apprehension, particles that do not have parts, such as an Eastern side. So this is actually an assertion of some non-Buddhist schools, but also of some Buddhist schools, that there are these partless particles, right? And they're asserted by some of the what's it called, lesser vehicle or Hinayana or some, some of those philosophical schools assert partless particles. Both the Madhyamikas and the mind-only school refute those. But he's saying if that's what, so you'll see in text, they'll be refuting those. Does that make sense? There are actual texts where they're refuting. There's no such thing as partless particles. Because there isn't. In other words, that's correct, but that's not the subtle object of, actually physics also refutes those, right? But, like we used to have there used to be some idea of kind of like atomic particle, something that's partless though, actually. Even atoms have parts, right? Which is part of the point. Anyway, what he's saying here is, so you'll see in text or in your meditation, let's say you're meditating, you're refuting partless particles, or you're reading a text, that's a correct thing to refute, but it's not the innate ignorance, innate grasping. Then he says, internal apprehending consciousness, moments of awareness without time parts, such as earlier and later, a continuum of awareness joining such partless moments together. So that's something that some schools grasp at, that there's like an inherently existent consciousness, right? And actually, according to this school, the mind-only school grasps at that, right? At a kind of an inherently existing consciousness that exists from its own side and so on. And he's saying again, you'll see Buddhist texts that are refuting such a thing because there are others who assert it, right? Sometimes, actually, you'll see in Chandrakirti, for example, when Khenpo Rinpoche teaches that text, there's a section in it, I think, where he he's sort of challenging the mind-only school, right? And so he's refuting the existence of an inherently existing consciousness with moments of, with like kind of these irreducible moments of awareness or something. And part of what we're saying here is he's refuting that because it's an acquired wrong view or acquired misunderstanding philosophically of some people, but that's not the innate one. Does that make sense? It's an acquired or a artificial it's not innate to beings. It's something that somebody could acquire from studying philosophy and sort of developing an idea that something exists. And so it should be refuted, but it's not the innate grasping. Then he's saying self-consciousness that is non-dualistic in terms of being empty of such objects and subjects. And so there, again, you'll see also Chandrakirti refutes this. There's this idea of self-consciousness, which is a kind of, it's actually some schools of philosophy, and the mind-only school is one of them, believe that memory can only exist if there's something called self-consciousness. So kind of that when you're aware of something, there's a kind of an awareness that's aware of you being aware of it. That memory only exists, it depends upon that. And they say because if you didn't have this sort of reflexive self-awareness, then how could you remember having seen something? And the Prasangika school says, no, that doesn't exist at all. Like you remember like they say, because their position is, I won't get into the whole philosophical debate on that. There's a whole philosophical debate that the Prasangikas give to disprove that they say there is no such thing as this kind of continuous, the self-awareness or this self-awareness is something that those who assert it say is always functioning. It's always there as a kind of reflexive self-awareness that's aware of each moment of your awareness, in a sense. Anyway, the mind-only school, asserts that. Prasangika school says that doesn't exist. It's a sort of fiction or something. And again, what Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying is you'll find texts refuting that. It's correct to refute that. That's why Chandrakirti does it. But that's again an acquired or an artificial grasping of the self. That's not the innate one. Does it make sense what he's getting at? You get the overall point he's getting at here. He's saying there are many objects that are refuted in various texts that are refuting philosophically acquired versions of self-grasping. And he's saying those are not the subtle one. And so he's just saying, so if you meditate on those, if you study those, fine, but that's not refuting the innate. Now he says, rather, it is the two innate apprehensions of self that all those whose minds are or are not affected by tenets have in common, that have operated beginninglessly without depending upon the minds being affected by tenets. So now he's being very clear. I don't know if so I'll stop there. So here he's being very clear. He's saying all those other ones are acquired by philosophical study of tenets, and actually some of those in a sense are useful. Like in other words, sometimes some of these are Buddhist views that are quite useful, but eventually you have to give them up, is the point. So like in other words, somebody who hadn't studied any philosophy and then acquires the view of the mind-only school is quite positive. But eventually they're going to have to give up that grasping at a philosophical tenet of a phenomena that exists inherently. But here he's being very clear, right? So he's saying, in terms of overcoming the cause of suffering or the root cause of samsara, that ignorance, he's saying those are the two innate apprehensions of a self. So a self, a person, self, phenomena. And he's saying these have existed beginninglessly, right, in our mental continuum, and are not philosophically acquired. They're innate. That's what he's saying. Then he says, he quotes, and then he says, a sense here, just that is held to be the root of cyclic existence here. Does that make sense? So he's saying, here means in the Prasangika school, right? So he's saying from the Prasangika schools, that is the root of samsara that must be overcome through the wisdom, understanding, emptiness. And then he quotes the commentary on the middle way. In those who spend numerous eons unconscious as beasts, and do not perceive this unborn permanent something, the apprehension of a self is still seen to operate. So that quote is saying this, right? It's saying, when this line, an unborn permanent something, like an atman, right, or some kind of idea of a soul, right? And he's saying, if only the idea, if the Buddha were just refuting some philosophical tenet, like the idea of a soul, and we're saying that's the cause of samsara, then animals would already be liberated because they don't have some idea of the soul, right? Babies would be liberated, they don't have some idea of the soul. Insects would be Buddhas or enlightened because they don't have an idea of the soul, right? And he's saying, no, he's saying, right? He's saying sentient beings, right, who spend eons in the animal realm, right, still have this innate grasping. It's an important point, right? You have to understand like what he's getting. It's very profound. I think this one verse is quite profound. I mean, all these are profound, but what he's getting at here, though, is something very deep, right? Which is because when you're trying to find the object of negation in your own experience, it has to be that instinctual. Does that make sense? It's something that insects, we share with insects. It's that innate. Does that make sense? That we share with, like, fish or something. Like, it's that innate. Does that make sense? It's something that's that instinctual. That's another way I think of innate would be like instinctual, right? Grasping at itself of person and of phenomena, right? Like, so you think of a fish, right, that feels I, and then object, like it's something that it considers food, and it's going to eat it, right? It's that innate, it's that instinctual, it's that deeply within our being, it's been there beginninglessly, and so that's what we have to identify as the innate self-grasping.
So, our Buddha nature is also innate. That's a little bit in conflict with that innate. I mean, it's sort of like, I was raised Catholic, can't help it. Sounds smacks of original sin.
And this actually, a couple of things. Like one is, this is definitely not talking about original sin, of course, but
Right, but it just kind of smacks us of that because it's some badness you're born with instead of the goodness that I was running on.
Actually, if you reminded me actually of the first Panchen Lama, Losing Choki Gyaltsen, who wrote the Guru Puja that we do oftentimes. He wrote a beautiful text that's like, I forget the exact title, but it's basically a debate between he talks about like a debate between ignorance and wisdom. It's sort of this, and he's getting at this point in a way. Because what he said, it's quite a funny text actually, because at one, I can't remember all the details of it now, I've read it a while ago, but he says, he addresses something like this, where he starts to say, it's actually a dialogue. So like, he has his own, I guess, in this he's pretending. It's a play. It's almost like it's not a play. It's an actual, but it's like a dialogue, right? And so he has like his own innate self grasping, arguing or having a debate with his own wisdom mind. And at one point, like you know, actually, for example, like ignorance will say, you know, I've been around forever, like, you know, like I'm more important, or something like that, right? And then of course, you know, wisdom will kind of point out, actually, you know, like the thing you grasp at hasn't been around forever, doesn't even exist now, never existed, you know, so and so on, right? In other words, it's based on a illusion, you know, so it's not really real. Buddha nature has actually been there, you know, since beginningless. Like and you know, and emptiness has been there, actually from the beginning, from beginningless time. This is just a hallucination and so on. And then actually, it's funny. Then at one point, I'll just share the thing. Remember, ignorance kind of says, ignorance tries to insult wisdom, saying, "Well, look around." Actually, we reply now as well as then. Ignorance says, "Well, look around the world. Like nobody seems to be interested in you." You know, wisdom, and wisdom says, you know, well, actually the wise are interested, you know, and so on. Like, they have this debate back and forth. It's quite a funny debate, but and the point, I guess I would say this, like, part of the point is this, is, one is, it's not, it's, what's there to say, right? What he's getting at, I mean, this point about innate ignorance is that each moment of ignorance is dependent upon previous ignorance. That's really what we're getting at here. So, in other words, but it's not innate, there's actually a difference. I think it's an important point that you're getting at. The innate ignorance that we have is dependent upon previous ignorance, right? And the Dalai Lama points this out, and that's what the Panchen Lama is getting at in that text, is that fundamentally it's founded on something that's incorrect. Not a sin, but actually an incorrect way of apprehending things. And so, ultimately it's founded upon something false. And so it can be overcome, and it can be gotten rid of. It's still, the word Jeffrey Hopkins uses in some of his translations, it's adventitious, meaning it's not actually inherent to our being. It's not intrinsic to our being.
So it's not, it couldn't be innate, because it couldn't have been born there, it had to have started somewhere.
Well, and what they're saying is, like, there's not a, here, it's actually an interesting point, they're saying there's not a, because the Buddhist view is that consciousness and samsara are beginningless, they would say you can't find a specific beginning point, but at any given point, if you were to go back, if the Buddha with his omniscient mind were to look back and your continuum, say, or my continuum, and say, well, you know, 17 billion eons ago, there was this version of self, you know, you were self-grasping and this, as this being, and with this name and this place. And then still there would be, but that throws dependence upon a previous being and a previous moment of self-grasping. So it's beginningless. They can use the word innate because it's beginningless, in a sense, right? It's beginningless in the sense that we're born with it.
But it's only beginningless because our brains can't comprehend the nature of it actually beginning sometime that we can never identify because it's an indefinite period back.
Actually, the Buddhist view would be really like that. Lama Zopa, actually, I have a T-shirt actually from Lama Zopa Rinpoche that he wrote, and he says, he says, which has no beginning but has an end. Speaking of this ignorance, so he said that's Lama Zopa Rinpoche's way to describe it. He says it has no beginning but it has an end. So that's the important point. That ignorance, Buddhism asserts, doesn't have a beginning, because even the Buddha can't see a beginning to it, according to Buddhism. But it does have an end, because it has an antidote. And the antidote is the wisdom, understanding, emptiness, which is what we're studying. So that's the Buddhist position on that, is that it has no beginning, but it has an end. And this is the important point, though, is that the Buddha nature has no beginning and has no end. I mean, if you include the Buddha's emptiness, you know, the emptiness, I mean, well, actually, they label it. They say the Buddha nature then becomes the, you know, nature body of a Buddha. So in that sense, it sort of it gives a different label, but it's the same. It's the emptiness of the consciousness itself, and that has no beginning, the emptiness of the consciousness has no beginning, has no end. Even the Buddha has that. So actually, you could say, one way of saying it is, in a way, you could say they're both innate, but it's kind of funny. But Buddha nature is more innate. I would say that's my own description. It's not the way that's not words they use. But in the sense that it's more innate in the sense that the ignorance, this innate ignorance, can be destroyed by wisdom, whereas the Buddha nature, you could say that the Buddha nature is also beginningless, but is indestructible, and nothing can destroy that. So in that sense, if you could say, I mean, in one way, if you're talking about like we're born with both Buddha nature and ignorance, that's true. We are, if we're an ordinary person. Buddha isn't born with ignorance, of course, but.
We don't have to die with it.
But you could say that the Buddha nature is more innate in the sense that it's indestructible, whereas the other has an antidote and can end. Right? As Lama Zohar says, it has no beginning but has an end. Whereas Buddha nature has no beginning and no end, is indestructible, is and is our ultimate nature actually. Whereas the other is founded upon an illusory, a false appearance or something. It's founded upon a false view, a false apprehension, a false way of apprehending. Is the right way to say it. Does that?
Yeah, it does.
And just
Or Cynthia for
Yeah, go ahead.
so I have a simpler question. So to understand the object, to really identify the object of negation, is it beneficial then that we identify all these other things that are not innate? Does it help us towards identifying the correct object of negation if we try these other things, even though it's not the true object of negation?
I think I'll just say my best understanding of the answer to your question on that is, it's a good question, is I think it depends on the person. And I'll say what I mean by that. To be specific, I'm not trying to be general, but it is that like there are some people I think who who let's say like if you think of the historically speaking, there are some Buddhist practitioners who just received kind of instruction directly on this topic, like didn't study tenets, didn't study philosophy, but their Lama, their teacher, their guru, gave them some very kind of personal instruction on how to identify the innate one directly, and then they went off and practiced in retreat somewhere, and they meditated a lot on that, and they realized emptiness, so they didn't have to do this other. But then, I think so there are some people, it's like some people where they don't have to study other philosophical perspectives, and they can kind of directly identify the object of negation, the innate one, and sort of then, their teacher gives them some kind of pith instructions, and they go off into retreat, and then they can correctly realize emptiness. So we can't say they have to do that. But then there are I think that what they would say is many students, or the majority probably, of who are correctly have gained realization. The Dalai Lama emphasizes this point oftentimes. He says, in our modern time, it's rare to have that. And that by studying these other philosophical schools and understanding what they assert to be existent and non-existent and so on, then we can come to a more correct understanding of the Prasangika school's position. So the Dalai Lama will often say, I've read or heard, I can't remember which, but so there are these examples of people who didn't have to do that kind of extensive study, and they correctly realized the view, so we can't say it's impossible. And the Dalai Lama often will say, but in this modern time, it's very good if one can study and identify those other ones. And one reason for that is that, one is it's hard to identify correctly. And if you can identify these other ones that are grosser, then it helps you understand correctly what this one is not, and you can correctly... let me finish this first. And then, so that's one part. And then the other part of that is that, they sometimes say that, again, for people where it's harder, in a sense, they sometimes say, they sometimes teach, in the Glukpa tradition and other traditions similar, when they teach tenets, so they'll start with the grossest, not gross in the sense of bad, but less subtle level of tenet system. which in this, usually if they break it up, there are many tenet systems actually, there are subsets, but they usually, if they break it into four, it's the Vaibhashikas that they start with. And part of what they're doing there is, for somebody who's like a beginner, in a way, they'll say, well, can you understand this system, right? And sort of get it and meditate on it a little bit. And then you start to get to the next subtler one. And then it's like, oh, wow, I can see how that's, and then you go through a process like what he's describing here, and eventually you get to the innate one when you get to studying the Prasangika school. So it's either way is possible, is my point. So you don't have to do this, it's not required to go through those other ones. But for those of us, who are, I'll say my own experience, like my own experience with that sometimes is like, I remember at times like I would think, oh, I kind of get what the Prasangika school is saying. And then I was reading Lama Tsongkhapa's explanation, his explanation of what the mind-only school says. And I thought, I was looking at it first, I thought, I can't tell the difference. It seems exactly the same to me. And of course he's saying it's totally different, completely different. And I'm going, but what's the difference? I had to keep reading it over and over. And then I realized, well, I hadn't correctly understood, of course, the Prasangika school's position, because if I did, I would know what the difference was the first time I read his explanation of why it's different from the mind-only school's position. So for me, that was very useful in that sense, because it helped me understand what my own misunderstanding was. I wouldn't have even known I was misunderstanding something if I hadn't read his commentary to the other, for example. So I was like, oh wow, that helped me personally in that way. I'm sure it helps other people.
So the Dalai Lama.
Oh, she was next. Yeah, she was next. Yeah.
I'm kind of back to the previous one. The innate is, so am I understanding correctly that it's terminology, without getting into beginningless time and all that, there's things we've learned and there's things that we just seem to be born doing.
Yeah.
And the innate is referring to that. So I can learn tenet systems, I can learn like how to look for myself, my sense of I and all that. But the innate part is like looking at a TV show and crying or getting angry. Like that's the innate part, right? Like to just get so, that's the part we're trying
That's your previous
ultimately,
experience, though, right?
like to, that innate ability to just even, these are what, pixels on a screen and some sound waves, and yet we can be moved emotionally. That's the part we're trying to uproot.
Yeah.
So that we would actually look at a TV show and we could, we'd still see the story and understand, but we wouldn't
Can I say something?
get as involved in it.
Can I
Well,
say-
let me answer her and then we'll get,
I've some question.
because a couple of points in relation to what you were saying, like, I'll go back, like, one point I'll make is that you're right, in other words, like, whether, the non-innate, right, whether it's studying philosophy, and things like that, but even culture, right, like, culture teaches things and people grasp at them and so on. Like, if you grow up in a certain culture, then there are things that we learn to grasp at as true, and all of that would be the artificial. Right? So, I mean, philosophical tenets is not the only way we get sort of intellectually acquired ones. Our culture can do that and so on, and then we can, and so on. That's clear. But yeah, you're right. Like, and actually, if you think of it this way, like, we're all like that. Like, actually, when you said that, what struck me was like, sometimes you'll see, like, for example, a baby, if there's something they want, and if it's on a TV screen, they'll try to get it, right? As if it's really there. And a dog will sometimes do that too, right? Yeah. Or cats will do that, and and yeah, you're right. That's an obvious example of a result of our innate grasping. And part of the thing, though, that like if you're watching a show, so you say it right, and you're not that interested in it, like if you think it's bad acting, right? And you're kind of watching it, and you're aware it's just a show. Like you're actually being aware it's just a show, and so you're not caught up in it. Part of my point is that I think like people who have realized emptiness relate to real life that way.
Exactly.
Like it's just a drama.
Exactly. No.
It's just some story. It's not really, it's not just some story, but it's just a drama.
It is our previous lifetime. Everything watching television is our previous lifetime, and the future time that is coming. We're projecting what we have already experienced, and we project what we will experience in the future. Everything we watch is all our past lives, everything that appears on TV is what we project what we have experienced, is also what we project what we experience in future. All the shows we see is like different realms, like we have been into, like Star Wars, like all those shows. We're projecting whatever we have experienced, or we will experience in the future. So the Dalai Lama says the meaning of ignorance, to conquer ignorance, you have to use awareness. That's what he says. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true.
What about the pain arising though? He says awareness. So what about the pain arising?
Awareness of dependent arising.
No, he just says awareness, that's it.
Oh, but you have to say, then you have to finish the sentence.
I have to finish.
Awareness of what?
The Dalai Lama doesn't finish, so he says awareness.
Yeah.
To conquer ignorance, you have to be aware, that's it.
Yeah, but aware, but I'll just put, I think the
I don't know what he
intention
means by that.
would be awareness of dependent arising. That's the meaning.
Yeah, but he doesn't use the pain arising.
Other times you said it.
Okay.
Because, yeah, it's not awareness of, say, chocolate.
I don't know.
I won't do it. I tried that one. Awareness of chocolate doesn't get rid of the thing. I tried it myself. Awareness of ice cream doesn't work. Awareness of donuts, no. I tried. Those are easy. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. But does that answer your question too?
Yes.
Yeah. So he says here, through this reasoning, it can be understood that what binds all sentient beings in cyclic existence is innate ignorance. And since artificial ignorance is only present in proponents of tenets, it is inadmissible as the root of cyclic existence. So he's just very clear. Then he says, it is extremely important to gain a discriminating certainty about this. If now, again, he's what he said. When Lama Tsongkhapa says it's extremely important, you get the message. But to gain a discriminating certainty. What is discriminating certainty, right? That means, in part, right, if you go back to, well, and different ways of saying it, but it's not enough just to read this, in other words, right? You have to actually think about it. What he's saying here is, stop and think about what he's saying. Another way of saying this is stop and really think deeply about this. This is an important point if you're going to practice. Does that make sense? And that you have to understand this for yourself, through your own reasoning. Does that make sense? He's saying, like, don't just trust me. Right? Think deeply, like the Dalai Lama always says, right? Dalai Lama says too. Right? Don't just trust my words on this. Think deeply about it. Right? And come to your own, discriminating certainty would be like through your own reasoning. Come to a clear realization or clear insight about this. He says, if you do not understand that, then at the time of settling emptiness by means of the view, you will not know how to hold the main thing as the ascertainment of the absence of real existence as apprehended by innate ignorance, and how to negate objects of artificial apprehensions as a subordinate to that. Right? So what he's saying here is if you don't understand this point clearly through your own experience, then one point is, he's making a lot of points here actually. One is, the main point is to overcome innate ignorance. And then as he say it, negating other artificial apprehensions is subordinate to, or is like a branch of that, is a kind of side point to that. And that, so then when you go off and meditate, right, if what he's getting at here, I think, is let's say you go off and you're doing, imagine you go off and you did a weekend retreat on emptiness, right? Well, it's not wrong. In other words, if you find yourself grasping at one of these other grosser versions, or let's say you haven't acquired philosophical grasping and it's coming up, but you do have to refute that, right? Like, so for example, it can happen. Sometimes if you're in retreat, I'll just give this is true actually, right? If a person is meditating on the nature of their own mind, right? There can come a point where you're grasping at the inherent existence of mind, right? And feeling like, what does he say? Up above. As if the moments of awareness without time parts of earlier and later, as if the mind itself has some kind of, the moments of consciousness have some kind of intrinsic existence. And there is a value then to meditating on refuting that through various philosophical, lines of reasoning, in other words, in your meditation, and you can overcome that. But if you don't know that that's not the innate, then you'll just sort of go, oh wow, I realized, okay, that's emptiness. And you'll sort of just stay with that. And what he's getting at is that, let's finish this point. What he's getting at here is that beneath that, you're still having self-grasping, right? Because you haven't identified the correct object of negation yet. And so then your meditation will be actually a meditation on self-grasping in a subtle, very subtle way, and you won't be meditating on actual emptiness yet, as this is explained in the Prasangika school, and that there's a use to it negating that grosser thing. And I'm going to give a metaphor for a second. Like if I have a shirt, like if I had been out like in a day like today in the woods or something, and I had a shirt that had like all this kind of mud on it and all that, and it had like some grease and all kinds of things. Like, you know, like first I would have to get, like, if there were like big clumps of mud, well, actually I shouldn't even put it in my washing machine, right? I'd probably want to like take it and scrub those off or something, you know. And so that's useful. Like those would be like these other things. Does that make sense? But if I just did those and then said, "Oh, great, I'm going to put the shirt on," you know, like that wouldn't work very well, right? Like it wouldn't actually be clean. So I'm just using a metaphor, right? So part of the idea is these other ones, you do use them sometimes to get rid of like the gross clumps of wrong view. But then you have to identify the correct object of negation and meditate on its negation, the innate one, right? And abide in that, and that's actual meditation. Emptiness, and if you don't do that, then your meditation on emptiness will actually have a subtle version of self-grasping still there and won't serve as an antidote. No, sorry.
Well, what was that phrase you used in the middle there? The something about the mind. Because that's kind of what I think of as innate ignorance. Thinking that. I wish I could remember how you said it.
Oh, I see. Well, I was quoting like here. He says, I was using an example, I think, of number 3 above, where he says, internal apprehending consciousness, moments of awareness without time parts, such as earlier and later, and a continual awareness joining such partless moments together. So, I mean, there he's saying one innate, one that's not the innate, right? He's saying one philosophically acquired form of grasping would be grasping at that, grasping at sort of intrinsically existent moments of consciousness. Right, and a continuum that, and then like a kind of a truly existent continuum of those moments, which is and he's saying that's not the innate.
The thing I think of as innate seems to be coming out of consciousness. So I'm trying to see how ignorant my ignorance is. I'm a little confused. So I'll stop.
Made up.
I think you're getting made up. Yeah, it's made up.
Yeah, made up.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess one thing is, I think it's great that, I don't know exactly which one you're getting at, but I'll just share a thought, which is I think the process you're doing in this kind of moment is part of the goal. It's not the goal, but it's part of the process. It's what's good. It's healthy, right? It's like that's what we're supposed to be doing. I think is going, oh wow, I thought this was the innate, but maybe it's not the innate. Like,
Yeah.
and that's, you know, like Ken Rinpoche tells that story, right, about Pagmo Drukpa, right, who was a disciple of both. He was his main, I guess, his main teacher was Gampopa, I think, but he also studied with I think Sachin Kunganingpo, the great Sakya Lama. He studied with many. Ken Rinpoche tells a story where he went around to different masters, right, asking them each, what's the object of negation, like, what's the innate object of negation, and then they would tell him something, and he would meditate on it, but he wouldn't realize it, and then he'd go to somebody else. He was just trying to get, not that those teachers were wrong, but he was like trying to find a teacher who could help him personally identifying in his own experience, right? So he went all over, I guess, all over different parts of, I think, central Tibet, asking different teachers, like, what's the, and it's like a hard process to identify it in our own experience. And he was a great, I was recently reading this, I was like, wow, he was considered like a master of the Sakya Lamdre teachings, which are quite advanced teachings. But in his own view, he had not yet realized the exactly correct object of negation, so that's why he kept going. And finally, I guess Gampopa, Geshe will say that he finally met Gampopa, right, who was Milarepa's disciple. And Gampopa, I guess he said to him, what's the, and I'm not sure I'll remember the exact wording, but I think Geshe Rinpoche said, he said, what's the object to be negated? I think Gampopa said to him, everything you've ever experienced, and he fainted. He kind of freaked out. And they said then he kind of woke up from his faint and he realized emptiness. And which I guess was just Gampopa knew him and knew what to say to help. Somehow he knew what to say to help him in that moment to get the experience or something. It was. Yeah. Anyway, you could give different answers to that question, of course, and all those other lamas weren't necessarily wrong. It was just and Gampopa, I'm not sure you could philosophically debate with Gampopa maybe, but Gampopa was getting at what that student needed to have the experience in that moment. So this process of sort of going, oh, is what I thought it? Well, we're in good company. We're like Pagmo Drupa. By asking those questions, we're like Pagmo Drupa, right? We're going like, my teacher told me it's this. I think I know it, but maybe there's something slightly You know, that's a good process, is what my point. And that's, I think, what Lama Tsongkhapa is encouraging us to do, is to keep asking that question more and more deeply.
The, the, the way that we like just constantly sort of explain the world to ourselves. So like if we, even if we're just watching an interaction or we're involved in it, like we right away explain why the other person is doing what they're doing, right, to ourselves. We're not necessarily right. I'm not saying we explain it correctly, but we just sort of go about explaining the world to ourselves. Is that innate ignorance, or is that something else? I mean,
I think that's, like going back to the example of that he was giving about how the body sense pervades the mental afflictions. I would say that's like, that most of what you're describing, the sort of these explanations, are like the way the different, like, you could say that the innate self-grasping pervades those things, but it's not, I don't think it's
not
that.
that.
It's like, you know, that, like, so I believe that, like, so, you know, somebody's doing something, and then, first I'm unaware of it, but I'm having innate grasping of them as existing in a certain way, you know, existing truly as or whatever, existing intrinsically. And then based on that, I make some sort of story. Oh, they're really angry, or oh, they're jealous of this other whatever. Like I make up, but that's all dependent upon. But it's not those like those. And you know, and part of the proof of that, right, is that like, you know, like we've had this experience, right, where you make up a story about somebody, like, oh, they did it for this reason, and then you go up to them and talk to them, and they say, no, like I was doing that for this other reason, and then you go, you have this realization that your story was incorrect, but you don't realize emptiness at that, like. At the moment when you realize, oh, my story was totally, like, sometimes you can, like, laugh at yourself, right? Like, oh, I made up this whole complicated view of why they were doing that, and then when I went to talk to them, I found out it was completely the opposite of that. But you don't realize emptiness at that time, so that's not the objective. Yeah.
But the mechanism that we so...
I would say that it's dependent upon, I think that's the right way to say it. It's dependent upon innate self-grasping, but it's not the actual innate self-grasping. That's a grosser or a more coarse sort of process that arises in dependence upon. Yeah, there's another way. Sometimes in Buddhist texts they'll say, one way they sometimes say it, it's not, Lama Tsongkhapa here doesn't use this phrase, but some other Buddhist texts do, where they'll talk about independence upon, like, grasping at the inherent existence self, let's say, that then limitless elaborations can then be, well, that can then arise, you know, and they're talking about mental elaborations. And so I think what you're describing are the limitless mental elaborations. So the idea is that independence upon self-grasping, actually we can make up, you know, and it's true actually, right? We can make up, you know, like, and you know, countless different mental elaborations, and he'll get into that later about good, and actually he gets into that in the text, about good and about bad and about attractive and unattractive, and then you know, from those all kinds of details then come of like, and those are like the mental elaborations that arise in dependence upon self-grasping, but they're not self-grasping itself. Yeah, that's clear. Yeah, various Buddhist texts. He actually says that in a different way here, but many Buddhist texts will say that in different ways.
I don't know, my take is that it's kind of a simple thing we're pointing to, is just kind of hard to cut through. It's just, I think there's stuff out there. There are things. There's me. It's just that's the object of negation, it seems like. Just that strong feeling of me, things, different things.
Yeah, in one sense that's true. I guess though, and again, but still one has to be, let's say it's right, like, just to make one challenge, one difficulty, of course, but there is a you.
So there's a Mara?
So then what? Because there is a you. I mean, you are sitting.
It's a me arising just as, you know, like in a dream, like, you know, it doesn't have a substantial basis. It's experiential as opposed to like existent or physical, stuff beyond that. But it's the very notion that there's any separation of things is just creation of mental experience. That feeling of there's a thing separate from me or a thing separate from another thing, like those are two different lamps.
Does that mean
It's a
everything?
creation of mind rather than, or a creation of whatever this is, rather than the way things are.
In one sense, I think you're right, but I'm just, again, like, just to sort of challenge ourselves, I would say, like, well, does that mean everything's really one? You say because viewing them as separate, which in a way you're right, but another, again, just like sort of challenge, does that mean that really the lamp and you are oneness?
Well, if you don't have, more than one, then, one exists in dependent upon many, right? So if
Yeah.
you don't have many, you don't have one either.
Yeah, exactly. So it can't be that they're one. Like, and I guess and all I'm getting at is, actually, what I'm getting at is this. Actually, really, is in Lama Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the Lama. He said, actually, the section on emptiness there is quite different from this one. That was written much earlier, and but they're both. They're both quite good texts. But there he gets to this point. He says about identifying the object of negation, which is what we're talking about. He says that part of the reason for the precision around it is that sometimes people, you could say it philosophically, like they call over-pervasive or under-pervasive, but really it's like sometimes people identify like these examples here, right? You could say are too narrow an object of negation. It's like saying that there's no such thing as a partless particle. Well, that's true, but that's too narrow an object of negation. And it's not the innate one, but it's also there are many other things that don't exist that we grasp at, and that's not you're not negating enough there. Is one sense. But then he says there's also the danger of negating too much, so we have to be careful in that sense too, right? That if we say, well, my sense of me existing or something is the object of negation, well, depending, it's very tricky, isn't it? Because it depends what the person. I don't, it's when we use words like that. It's interesting because the person may be identifying the correct object of negation, or they may be negating too much. Like if they're negating that they exist at all, that would be an incorrect object of negation because they'd be negating too much in the sense that they do exist. How because he says that earlier, right? How do they exist as that which is merely labeled on a valid base or so on? So I guess all I'm saying is like it was just striking me that the words you were using could a person who was correctly identifying the object of negation could probably use those words, or a person who was over-pervading in that sense could use those words. And I'm not sure which, but so that's why we have to keep just making sure we're correct, that we're identifying it correctly. That's all I'm saying. Does that make sense? Oh,
Yeah, he used the word dependent arising, which kind of clicked with me, and, resonated with me, because thinking about the object of negating of like us and things, and it was just even use those same words, the way that kind of connected with me is and he said, well, what does that mean you're not really here? Well, in a sense, I mean, I'm just a big old collection of molecules and quarks and weird things, and are we all one thing? I think actually, yeah, probably, yeah, but we have to perceive it as separately so we can think and stuff, sort of like in time, we have to line it so we can think, but isn't that the object of negation, is to understand and to sort of like deeply get that we are not in and of ourselves us any more than an object is in and of itself. Unless labeled based on dependent arising, is there, I don't know, go on with that.
Once you start, you can't stop.
So is it? I'm not sure what the question is. Or if there isn't. Reflecting.
With what he was saying, because it really connected with what he was saying about it being, is it really that simple? Because that's my where you kind of got it, if it got it at all.
Yeah, no, maybe it is. I'm not sure. Like I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying. Well, in that case, I'm just saying that we have to you know, 'cause, I mean, like his answer is like, you were correct, right? Or is if somebody were, because sometimes like people will say that, like, one has to be careful in the sense that if one says, you know, like for example, if I were to say we're all the same, in one sense that's true. Like we're all the same in wanting happiness, not wanting suffering. We're all the same in being empty of an intrinsic, you know. But then if I were to say, so if I mean there are different, you know, I'm just trying to be like one has to think through it for oneself and one's own experience what one means. Because if I say we're all the same and I mean we're all the same in wanting happiness, not wanting suffering, that's true. If I say we're all the same and I mean we're all the same in being empty of inherent existence, that's true. If I say we're all the same and I mean we're all literally exactly the same, that's not true. You know, if I say we're all the same and I mean we're all literally one, that's not actually true.
We're all uniquely the same.
You know, so it's quite tricky. I mean, so I guess all I'm saying is one has to be clear what one means. Yeah, you good. We have to be clear what we mean by it. And I can't sometimes tell, you know, if, like and I'm not trying to, you know, so everybody has to figure it out for ourselves what we mean, because there are certain ones where it would be incorrect. Say it again?
I said, using that phrase, uniquely the same, has kept me up at night once or twice.
It's a good reason to be up.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
So Dr. Lord, earlier when you said over-perversion or under-perversion in trying to identify...
Oh, pervasion. Under pervasion or over pervasion, yeah.
Yeah.
Over perversion is a whole other issue that also does exist, but it's a different...
English is second language to me, so...
No, I'm just joking.
So would it be apt to say that if you were to over-pervade yourself in identifying it, you're headed towards probably nihilistic part of yourself?
Exactly, yeah.
And if you're doing under, then you're going on the extreme side, let's say,
Of true existence, yeah, then you're grasping it, still going to be grasping at true existence, exactly. That's exactly what Lama Tsongkhapa's view would be on that. Yeah, is that if you over-pervade, if you identify an object of negation that's an over-pervasion, and then you negate that, you'll end up in nihilistic. And if you under-pervade the object of negation, you'll end up in, you know, sometimes say eternalism, or you'll still end up with left over with some grasping.
Okay, so then
yeah.
I'll top it off by saying, so in terms of balancing over and under, wouldn't be such that a person would go through a lot of depression trying to understand and getting that balance at times, as well as going through a lot of excitement at other times?
Oh, are you connecting it to like the process of developing calm abiding?
I mean, ultimately it's coming down to samatha and vipassana. I mean, that's the only way to do it, to get that done.
Oh, I see. Yeah, but no, those would be two different issues. Like, there was the if you like the object of, I mean, the process of developing calm abiding, where one has kind of mental excitation and then mental. What's the word we were using?
Laxity?
What's that?
Laxity?
Laxity. Yeah, laxity. That's it. Laxity. Like that's one process where one has to find the right.
But without that, you're not even going to contemplate and find the innate part of it. It's given. I mean, unless you have that kind of tranquility and that kind of insight into it.
No, I'll debate it in a second, because I'll debate that in a way. Because here's one, like I think of, for example, actually, I mean, Kenshin says, but also many teachings say this, that a person who has not yet developed, like sometimes that's true, but sometimes not. I'll give an example. Sometimes a person who has not yet developed calm abiding can have a correct inferential realization of emptiness, where they actually realize emptiness, but it's not a direct realization, right? So for that person, they don't have calm abiding yet, but they have correctly identified the object of negation, and they've correctly refuted it through correct, like a deep process of analysis, and it's not over-pervaded or under-pervaded. They've actually realized the correct view of emptiness. And actually, like, then there's there's one tradition. It's rare. I mean, it's more common as you develop calm abiding first. Many people first develop calm abiding, and then based on that, they realize emptiness. But there's actually a tradition where a person can correctly gain a correct inferential realization, and it's a true realization of emptiness. It's inferential still. And then based on that, they develop their calm abiding based on that realization, actually. So their object of concentration is their understanding of emptiness. And then they have the process of developing calm abiding, where instead of visualizing a Buddha or visualizing some other object or meditating on, their object of concentration is emptiness, and then they realize calm abiding based on the object of concentration, which is emptiness. So there is that person realized emptiness in a completely correct way, and then later developed calm abiding. I'm just giving an example where that's possible. Definitely, there are many texts that say that happens for some practitioners. Some practitioners do it in that order. Others do it in the other order. So it depends on the person. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, okay, I'll continue. So then he says, again, in this paragraph that's about the extremely important, right? He says, if you negate the two selves, neglecting the refutation of the mode of apprehension of innate ignorance, you will ascertain just the selflessness that negates imputations by only proponents of tenets mentioned earlier. Therefore, at that time of meditation, you will also necessarily meditate on just that, because the ascertainment through the view is for the sake of meditation. Right? So you get this point here. He's saying if you only negate these other, he gave just a few examples here, one could have others, right? But if you only negate something that's a intellectually acquired object, then your meditation on emptiness will only be the negation of that, which will not be an antidote to the innate self-grasping, and therefore won't serve as an antidote to samsara yet. It's like you've mistaken, what does he call it above here? A subordinate. You've mistaken the subordinate for the chief in a way, right? Whereas if you just negate those other things and you meditate on that, it's like, it's not that that's wrong, but you've negated in the sense of that it is correct to negate that. But it's like you've mistaken the subordinate and focused on that, and you haven't gotten to the chief point yet. And so he's saying this really for somebody who's going to go off and practice, right? That then your practice won't hit the essential point. That's what he's saying, and won't have the desired effect. Therefore, next, the absurdity of opposing innate mental afflictions by merely refuting the objects of artificial concepts. So he says, therefore, when you meditate on that selflessness and it becomes manifest, even if you take that familiarization to its completion, there will be nothing more to it than just that. Thus, it's very absurd to assert that through seeing the non-existence of the two selves merely as imputed by artificial apprehensions, the innate mental afflictions will stop. And so what he's saying is, right, if you don't identify correctly the innate self-grasping, your samsara will continue. Your mental afflictions will continue. And if you just, and it won't serve, and you won't achieve liberation, you won't achieve Buddhahood. And again, and part of, I think, what he's implying here is that many people have done that. And actually just, I'll just share, I'll just share a point about that. I'll read the next verse now. Share. So then he quotes commentary to the middle way. It says, when you realize selflessness, you abandon the permanent self, but that's not asserted as basis. That's not asserted as basis, of apprehending a self. Hence, it's quite odd to say that knowing such selflessness casts out the self-view. I'll make a quick point about that, and then I'll read the next verse, because it's important. I think we can get through that too, and it's important, but it's connected. But one point is, there's actually a teaching that describes how, I was just reading about it recently, where they were making this point, that they were saying there were some people who were, who had realized the lack of existence of a grosser object of negation, but not the innate one. And then they called them, they asserted that they were arhats. Because part of the point was, I was reading this description of them, it was saying they had developed calm abiding, right? And then they meditated on this grosser object, and they were able to temporarily suppress the mental afflictions, but they weren't uprooting them. Does that make sense? And then, of course, for that person, eventually the mental afflictions came back. And then that would be very disappointing if you thought you were an arhat and then your mental afflictions came back. And then they would become very upset, and then they sort of lost the path. that could happen. There are actual historical examples where somebody didn't identify the correct object of negation, meditated on a kind of a selflessness in a way, but it's the lack of, and he's giving here an example, lack of a permanent self, right, or a permanent unitary independent self. And through that, there's a power to that. If a person has deep concentration, their mental afflictions would temporarily be suppressed, but they're not uprooting them, right? And it's quite a serious. I mean, what's the word? From the perspective of the Buddhist path, that's quite a serious problem because they're not actually gaining liberation, and especially if you think you're gaining liberation, you're not. That's not good. And then he says, he quotes, I think this is Chandrakirti. He says, for clarification, at this point, the mutual unrelatedness is explained by way of an analogy. While seeing a snake in the hole in the wall of one's house, to make oneself abandon the fear of the snake by clearing up doubt, saying there is no elephant here, alas, that would be only laughable to others, right? So you get the point there, right? And this is, I mean, that's quite. If some of you have been reading Chandrakirti with Khenpo Rinpoche, that you really get that's Chandrakirti's sense of, right? It's like, you get the idea, right? He's saying it's that far off, right, from the solution. Then he says, although it is said with regard to the selflessness of persons, it is the same also with regard to selfless phenomena. When you realize selflessness, you abandon the artificial self, but that's not asserted as the basis of ignorance. Hence, it's quite odd to say that knowing such selflessness casts out the self-view. And one point here is, one good thing, and it goes back to, I guess it was Cynthia's question, is if you can meditate on the selflessness of the innate self-grasping, all the other philosophically acquired self-graspings will stop because of that. But unfortunately, it's like, but if you negate just the artificial ones, that won't eliminate the innate one. Does that make sense? So the person who's capable of just sort of going directly and realizing the emptiness of, who's empty is correctly and negating the innate one, all the acquired ones will stop, through that realization. They actually say that, I was pausing because it's like, they say that on the path of seeing, so when somebody realizes emptiness directly, that they get a permanent cessation of the ability, one of the sort of permanent cessations that's acquired when a person directly realizes emptiness for the first time on the path of seeing, is that they'll never again give rise to the false, to the intellectually acquired wrong understandings. And then until that point, they can still come back. Even if you correctly sort of eliminate a false one, over the course of lifetimes you can get it can come back. But if you once you achieve the path of seeing, that person, for the rest of until they achieve full enlightenment, it won't come back. Those intellectually acquired ones.
So, so what I understood in a nutshell of last hour and a half of this speaking about is Lama Tsongkhapa is almost saying all the schools, all the tenets, all of that we're talking about, it's just conditioning. It's an inference. It's not a direct. And as you see a direct one, you come to a conclusion that all of these breaths that got you there are just an
Or just what?
inferences. I mean, all the conditioning part of, you say Galuds, you say Kagyus, you say Sakyas, and basically what he's saying is all of that is just practices, inferences that you build upon. When you arrive there, none of these actually means much. It's just conditioning, philosophical learning, I almost get that.
Let me clarify and see because I'm not sure. Like, I think what Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying is, that, let's put it this way, like, and actually one thing is I mean, the different tenet systems here, of course, are not different. Those are like different schools of Tibetan Buddhism. He's talking about the tenet systems of Indian Buddhism. So like the Vaibhashikas, the Svatantrika, Svatantrikas, the Chinamatrins. So one point is he's talking about the sort of Indian philosophical tenets that all came to Tibet, that all the Tibetan traditions study. But then within that, one point I guess I'm going to say is like, part of what he's getting at here is that like, through studying, like, so whether a person, this is an important point, like, if you studied, whether it be one of those other Buddhist tenets, philosophical schools, or if you studied Hinduism or Christianity or Judaism or Islam or any, or Western, if you studied Kant or Hegel or, any of those, or Socrates or something. So it doesn't matter, it's not that you acquire certain intellectual ideas about the nature of reality, and that when you're trying to realize emptiness correctly, actually you'll have to use inference to overcome that inferential, or is that the word used? Inferential cognition. What he's saying here is inferential cognition is useful on the path in terms of, in two different ways. One way inferential cognition is useful is to overcome incorrect understandings about the nature of reality that you've acquired, and that you then need to use inferential cognition to actually experientially. You can't just say, you can't just say, oh, Chandrakirti said it's not correct, so it's not correct. You have to use your own inferential cognition to overcome those acquired ideas that may be that are contradictory to understanding emptiness. So that's one use of inference. But then he's saying there's another actual use of inference that's much deeper at this point. And that is that when you do correctly identify the innate self-grasping, and it's grasping, the first one you'll identify in practice to realize, when you're going to realize emptiness, is that very fundamental one that you're grasping at your own I, right? And what he's saying, Lama Tsongkhapa's position is, at that time, the time you're first going to realize emptiness, it'll be through inferential cognition, actually. So you're still going to use inference at that time. And in Chandrakirti's system, it might be likely, there's a good chance it'll be, what's the word? Absurd consequence version of inference, right? Where you suddenly realize, like, you have some experience of your own innate self-grasping, and you realize, wow, if the I existed that way, there would be these absurd consequences that don't fit with my experience. And then you would realize, therefore, it doesn't exist, right? You would have a realization. And then that inferential realization, a correct realization, that would be a correct inferential realization of emptiness. And then you'll sort of rest in that. That emptiness, which is very specific. It's the lack of existence of that object of negation, right? And that's an inferential realization. And that it's only, Lama Tsongkhapa's position is that it's only by then familiarizing, by resting again and again, by meditating again and again in that realization, that eventually it will become a direct realization. And they say the difference is the inferential realization is correct, and it's the only way to get to the direct, from Lama Tsongkhapa's perspective. But there's still actually, Buddhist path, if you look at the paths, like the 5 paths, all bodhisattvas, according to the 5 paths, way of describing this process, realize it what we're calling inferentially. And that what that means is that it's that they have a correct mental image, or you could say mental image or something of emptiness, and they meditate on that. And eventually, like, that becomes subtler and subtler in their experientially becomes subtler and subtler until there comes a point on the path of seeing where it becomes a direct realization that they say is totally non-conceptual and is a direct realization and is like water poured into water. They use different words for this experience. But you only get there through an inferential cognition of emptiness, which is based on some kind of correct mental image of that, of what emptiness is. And then eventually you come to this kind of completely naked, direct experience of it. So it's not saying that, so Lama Tsongkhapa wouldn't say that inference is negative in that sense. Actually, he would say inference is required. It's the only way that somebody who hasn't yet realized emptiness can realize emptiness. Of course, once the person has realized emptiness, then that's a different, then they have that realization that they can go back to maybe or something. But that for us who have self-grasping, we have to then first identify experientially that self-grasping, but then we have to use a kind of logic, inference, in order to have the experience of recognizing that it doesn't exist, because we are always grasping at it as if it does exist, and we won't realize that it doesn't exist without some kind of inferential cognition initially. Does that answer your?
Yeah, it kind of makes sense of what I was thinking.
Okay, good. I wasn't sure. I wanted to just make sure it was all clear. It's like, so exactly, yeah. So it fits with what you were.
Yeah, but it's part of the conditioning. I mean, these are conditioning. I mean, emptiness, until you see directly, is a part of a conditioning. That's what I was trying to say. I mean, he's agreeing with that.
Say again. Emptiness is part of our condition. What do you mean? I'm not sure I understand.
So right now, whatever emptiness we're talking about, like, at least for my sake, where I stand, I understand it's part of my conditioning, understanding emptiness. Conditioning meaning various learnings, various ways of thinking about it, contemplating about it. That I would call it conditioning.
So you're like conditioning your own mind to understanding emptiness.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
Up
fair.
to the point where I get that inference
Yeah.
of an object.
Yeah.
I have another question for you. So, at a moment of an extreme fear, would you think that would be a time where innate self would appear in some sense? Like, if I see a snake right there, and my awareness can grab that moment, would you say innate self is appearing a bit in that moment?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Like actually, there are many Buddhist texts that suggest, like, it's actually interesting, right? Like from one perspective, of course, like as Tsongkhapa pointed out to Pagmadrupa, the implication of what he pointed out is that in one sense, our innate self-grasping is always there. In other words, we never get, even in our dreams, or one time I asked Kenshin Rinpoche, I said, are we ever so distracted that there's no self-grasping? And he said, no. Like, never happened. He said, no, that doesn't really happen. It never happens yet, for somebody who's not realized it. So, but in many Buddhist texts, they suggest exactly what you're saying. They say, think of a time when you were very afraid, or think of a time when you were feeling hurt and were wrongly accused of something, or think of a time, these times that where where the appearance of the self-grasping is very vivid, and that's what you're getting at, where it comes up, and there are different examples. Like actually, Kenshin Rinpoche even told me a story. He said, I think if I remember correctly, I think he said it, that like with Trijang Rinpoche, I think it was, or something, that the Trijang Rinpoche took students up, like in Tibet, right, when they were still in Tibet, and they would stand like on the edge, and somebody would hold the person, but then they would if you've ever stood on the edge of a cliff, right, like even just going close to it, you get this, and then if you go really close to it, it gets stronger and stronger, right? So they would actually do that in order to identify the object. It's fear, that's what you were getting at, right? It's some kind of, you can feel it so strongly though, right, like in your chest or something, whatever it would be, but there are different examples, or a time when you felt really upset by something. Yeah, so they oftentimes, in a practice session, they'll say, if you're having a hard time identifying it, think of the examples like that, and then it'll be very vivid, and then you can use that in order to practice identifying the object negation. So exactly, correct. And then in a way that's also the practice of, in Chud, right, in the Tibetan tradition, where they go off to a scary place in the middle, go off to like a place that's considered haunted. And, it's a unique Tibetan tradition created by, it's influenced by Indian Buddhism, but it was really created by the female yogini, Machi Glapchen, who was like this great yogini. She developed this method of chud, right, where the person would go off, like you imagine like going off to like a haunted cemetery in the middle of the night alone, and you bang a drum and you blow a horn and you say, all demons and scary things come here. And of course, if you do that, and then if you imagine you're alone in the middle of the night in a place that is known to have haunted, and then you hear, of course, inevitably you'll hear sounds, right? And because if you're someplace in the middle of the night, there's, and then you go, like, you'll have some feeling, and then that would be your object. And part of the point of her method, I don't know all of it, I'm not great, but part of the point of her method is exactly what you're getting at. It's to give rise to that experience of the object of negation, and then you meditate.
But that's still very gross level, right? Because animals also experience that kind of thing.
Yeah, but it's innate. That's like animals have it, and we have it because it's very innate. It's very instinctual. Like I was saying earlier, it's this very innate sort of feeling, and if you can realize it based on that can help.
But that object you're saying, like everything that whatever. Because we're already Buddhas, right? We're all
Lama
Buddhas.
Tsongkhapa doesn't agree with
Yes,
that.
but we're all Buddhas already.
No,
No, it's true. We're all already Buddhas.
I'm not a Buddha.
Except the garbage we have accumulated, we have projected. That's all the garbage we have projected. That's what we have to overcome. We're already Buddhas already, but we have to overcome the garbage we have accumulated. That's it.
Some
Right.
Buddhist schools say that, but actually Lama Tsongkhapa would say,
Well,
of course
it
you're not a
is-
Buddha. Buddhas are omniscient.
But
Are you
that's
omniscient?
what Lama Tsongkhapa is still, he didn't get realized. He's not enlightened. He's not a Buddha yet.
Lama Tsongkhapa's view is that Chandrakirti, that the Madhyamaka school doesn't say we're already Buddhists.
Lama Tsongkhapa is not a Buddha yet. You know, because they say he realized rainbow body. But what's rainbow body? I mean, colors. I mean, he didn't realize Buddha yet. He has to realize Buddha. He still has obstacles to achieve to become a Buddha. So he's not complete, right, with his truth.
Actually, Betty, traditionally Lama Tsongkhapa is considered to be one of the three most important emanations of Manjushri to come to Tibet. Right, so they say that, who are the three? Longchenpa, Sakya Pandita, and Lama Tsongkhapa. They're considered like,
But they're just names, though.
they're considered to be
They're
the
just names.
emanations.
How do you believe them? They're just names.
That's true. They
Well,
are
we
names.
just believe whatever. Like Westerners just believe whatever they tell them to believe. But they're just names. Are they really there, existing there? Or we just hear names and we're like, oh yeah, they exist. I mean, they're just names. They're just labels we give to a base, very base. But in reality, they're there.
You never met Lama Tsongkhapa.
But from what I hear, from my experience, from what I hear, he never achieved Buddhahood. He still have the obstacles to overcome.
That's not the tradition, but maybe somebody might say that.
Tradition is a name too.
Yeah, that's true. You're right
Yeah.
about that. Tradition, isn't it?
Right. That's true.
Let's see. We have 5. I'll just do one more. I'll do one more point here. And then
So let me ask you a question. Does Yamataka exist? The Tibetan people tell us to recite mantras about Yamataka, right? And then we believe it. What's Yamataka? Does Yamataka exist?
That's a question I won't answer.
Eh?
I won't.
They say Tantra. Well, Tantra is what? We recite mantras. Does Tantra exist? But you believe it. You believe Rama. So you believe the Rama. You have faith in them. Does the Guru exist? You believe it. You have faith in the Guru. Does the Guru exist? Why do you have faith in the Guru?
I would say the Guru exists in the same way you exist.
Eh? The Guru is a name given to a particular base.
And Fidel is a name given to him.
But what I'm saying, in the Shakyamuni Buddha story, there's no such a thing as a Guru. But in Tibetan Buddhism, there is such a thing as a Guru. But Buddha's story, Buddha's Buddhism, there is no such Sanskrit Buddhism, such a thing as a Guru. So why do we buy the idea of somebody like the Lama who's so charming, smiling, beautiful, and then we buy the idea that, oh, they're Buddhas. Why? Why don't we question? We don't question.
Actually, go back. That was the very first point, right? In the Lam Rim.
Oh, yeah,
were
we
you
were-
here? You were here, right?
Yeah, no, I came here for the wisdom because
Oh, okay, yeah.
the other stuff was garbage.
Oh, but that's in the Lam Rim. So you study that.
No, what I'm trying to say is like everything we accumulate, we project everything, right? Let's say like Ramazopa says, we project things, then the illusion appears to us. Without projecting, the illusion can never appear to us. Then we hold on them. So you see, we're projecting everything we are projecting, then they appear to us. Let's say like sugar. Let's say like a sound. A sound, we project a sound, like right now we're hearing sounds, right? Can you hear sound, everybody? We are projecting a sound. And then we're hearing the sound, karma buying appears to us. Or 10 levels of karma buying appears to us. Depending upon somebody else. Everything depends upon others.
I'm not sure I understand, but
Yes, you understand one day.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Not today, it appears. I'm
You're
sorry.
just talking dependent arising.
Yes.
I mean,
I
you're
don't
off
know.
the subject.
Nagarjuna knows
But you're
better,
off the
right?
subject.
Nagarjuna knows better, right?
Yeah, it's fine, but you're off the subject. Let's get back on the subject.
But so I'll just do it. Oh, well, we're almost at time. I'll just do this last verse. So although both views are the same. Actually, this verse starts another section, and we only have a minute. So maybe I'll stop there actually, and I'll just say a couple quick comments for the next time. I'm just trying to think. Okay, yeah, no, because now we're getting into the whole thing about the view of the transitory collection, which is a different philosophical point anyway, which we'll cover next time. But so we finished that section that we had started, and I just want to double check. So the point, well, it's done quite a bit actually. I want to say a couple things and then we'll stop. One is, I keep emphasizing this point, but I hope people are getting it, so I just want to I'll keep emphasizing. You get the point about this text, right, because that's what we're actually studying. Like, that, like Lama Tsongkhapa, first of all, he's emphasizing this point about the object of negation, right, and that it's an innate object of negation. That's clear, I think, right? And then my last point, though, is this: I keep emphasizing this, that Lama Tsongkhapa, it's very interesting, I think, the way he's presenting this text. That it's on the one hand, it's the Lamrim, right, and I hope you're getting that there are two things going on that are totally related in a way. One is, this is practice instruction, right? This is not just, what's the word? Study for the sake of study. It's study to contemplate and meditate on, right? And I think it's very clear that that's his intention here. And at the same time, he's being extremely precise philosophically, right? And he's making many fine distinctions, right? It's not this from this tenet system. It's not that from that tenet system. And that's because Lama Tsongkhapa's sort of, and he did that throughout the Lamrim, didn't he? For those of you who've come to other parts. And part of that is that his point is that in Buddhism, right, all these like kind of philosophical points about the details, whether it's developed Kamabhidana, the details of how you develop Kamabhidana, or the details of how you develop compassion, or now the details, especially these details of how you understand emptiness, that they're based, that all those philosophical points, it's hard to understand how they relate to practice, but they relate to practice. That's the point, right? And he's trying to clarify for us. He's taking these things from different texts and from different points, and he's doing it because, and the Dalai Lama once said this, I was there, he said, because if you just pick up like a philosophical treatise by, let's say you pick up a philosophical treatise by Chandrakirti and you look at the section where he's refuting the existence of partless particles or something, right? Like, it could be a little difficult to understand, well, what's the role of that in practice, right? Like, it's correct, if you understand what he's saying, you can go, wow, that's profound, and he's right. But here, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying that is part of your practice. Whereas if you grasp at that, then when you go meditate on emptiness and you're sitting down to meditate, and if that's what, and if you have that kind of philosophically acquired view, then you need to use that line of reasoning. If you don't have that philosophically acquired view, then you don't need to use that line of reasoning. But you still, regardless, you need to use a line of reasoning that's going to negate the innate self-grasping, right? And that everybody has to do that practice. So you get the point there. Like he's using these different. He's sort of presenting it in this way of bringing in these different sort of philosophical points, and he's showing how you integrate those into your actual real practice as a person who's going to go off and meditate on this and contemplate it. And that's the point of all this. So, and he's going to continue doing that, throughout this section, and that's why also, if you study Lama Tsongkhapa's text, then you can go and study those other texts more easily. The text by Nagarjuna, say, or Chandrakirti. And when you do, remember at the very beginning, one of the benefits of Lamrim, there were like a list of various benefits of studying Lamrim, and one of them was it clarifies all the teachings of the Buddha as personal instruction. That's one of the benefits of studying Lamrim. And that otherwise, they were saying that at the very beginning, at the very, very beginning of this book, it was saying, because otherwise, it's hard to understand. There are all these whole walls of scriptures and all that, and you could say, well, how do you apply those to practice? And it's not easy. But if you've studied the Lamrim, right, then when you're studying any other text, let's say if in this case about emptiness or something, right, you can go, oh, okay, that's for that purpose. That's for overcoming this, and that's, and which one is the innate, to overcome the innate? Which ones are to overcome philosophically acquired? Which ones are, to overcome different, and how does that relate to my practice? And why am I doing it? To overcome suffering. So you understand the purpose of all those different teachings, and they arise, they arise for you as personal practice instructions then. And that's one of the benefits, and he's doing that here. He's helping us so that we can then go off, and when we read other texts and we go to meditate, it can arise for us as personal practice instructions, and we'll sit and practice it, and we'll be able to practice it because we'll know how from these practical instructions. So that's all. So let's do the dedication. The Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not diminish, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.